If you grew up between 1976 and 1980, you lived through a time that felt like a crossover episode between two wildly different decades. The psychedelic 70s were fading, but the neon-soaked 80s hadn't fully arrived yet. From Bicentennial mania to the mystery of early home computers, these are 10 forgotten things that only those who grew up in this weird and wonderful in-between era will truly remember. The Bicentennial celebration. In 1976, the United States turned 200, and if you were a kid at the time, you couldn't escape the red, white, and blue explosion that took over everything. And I mean everything. Fire hydrants painted like American flags. Your school cafeteria probably served bicentennial-themed lunch specials. Even your mom's Tupperware collection most likely starred an eagle or two. The bicentennial wasn't just a one-day event, it was a full-blown national obsession that lasted the entire year. Schools held patriotic parades, and kids proudly rode their decorated bikes while dressed like mini Revolutionary War soldiers. One person even recalled their mom handcrafting them a Colonial outfit, complete with a tri-corner hat. Think about that for a second. Today, kids beg for Marvel costumes. In 1976, they were out here dressed like George Washington. And then there were the souvenirs. If you still have a bicentennial quarter stashed away somewhere, congratulations, you own a tiny piece of this overly enthusiastic time period. These coins were handed out like candy, and some kids actually thought they'd be worth a fortune someday. Spoiler, they're not, but they are a nostalgia goldmine. Even then, President Jimmy Carter got in on the action. One person remembers receiving a $2 bill and a pat on the shoulder from Carter himself while visiting San Francisco's Ghirardelli Square. Imagine casually meeting the president while getting ice cream. Sounds unreal now, but in 1976, anything seemed possible. And let's not forget the fireworks. Forget the small backyard sparklers. Bicentennial fireworks shows were massive. Cities went all out, competing to see who could put on the biggest, most extravagant display. If you were a kid watching the night sky light up in red, white, and blue, it felt like you were witnessing something historic. But here's the thing, after 1976 ended, the bicentennial craze vanished almost overnight. By 1977, the Colonial outfits were packed away, the decorations came down, and life moved on. But for those who lived through it, that year of national pride and star-spangled enthusiasm remains unforgettable. And if you thought patriotic grocery store aisles were strange, wait until you hear about the bizarre, no-frills world of 1970s generic food products. Before every supermarket shelf was filled with bright, flashy branding designed to hypnotize you into buying cereal with a cartoon mascot, there was a brief moment in the late 70s when grocery stores decided to ditch the gimmicks. Enter generic food products, the most aggressively boring items ever stocked in an American supermarket. Picture this. You walk into the store, grab a box off the shelf, and it just says cereal in bold black letters. No cartoon tiger, no colorful stripes, no marketing fluff, just a plain white or yellow box with the most brutally honest label imaginable. Potato chips labeled potato chips. Beans, just beans. There was something almost dystopian about it, like shopping inside a government ration facility from a sci-fi movie. This wasn't some minimalist aesthetic choice either. These stark, no-frills products were a response to the economic hardships of the late 70s. Inflation was hitting hard, and families needed budget-friendly alternatives. Supermarkets introduced generic brands as a cheaper option. Stripped of advertising costs, mascots, and even basic design efforts. One person remembered a store in Chicago that had an entire aisle dedicated to these label-less wonders, where shopping felt more like restocking a fallout shelter than a trip to the grocery store. And if you think today's store brands are generic, think again. Modern, off-brand products at least try to look appealing. The generics of the 70s, they made zero effort. Some even used stencil-style fonts that looked straight out of an A-Team supply crate. It was as if the store itself was saying, "Look, do you want spaghetti or not? Because this is spaghetti, take it or leave it." For kids growing up in this era, generic products were a special kind of disappointment. Imagine opening a box labeled cookie wafers only to find the saddest, most flavorless excuse for a snack imaginable. No cool prizes, no fun packaging, just the food equivalent of a black and white documentary about tax laws. But here's the kicker, people actually miss this era. Not because the food was great, it wasn't, but because it was a uniquely 70s phenomenon. By the early 80s, marketing executives realized that people preferred their cereal to have some personality, and the era of brutally honest food labels quietly faded away. And speaking of futuristic disappointments, let's talk about what it was like to use a home computer in the late 70s. Early home computers. If you grew up in the late 70s, you witnessed something that felt like straight-up science fiction. Computers, actual computers, making their way into people's homes. Except instead of sleek laptops or voice-controlled AI assistants, these early machines were gloriously clunky, ridiculously complicated, and borderline magical. Owning a computer in the late 70s wasn't like today, where you just power up and start browsing the internet, which, by the way, didn't exist yet. Nope, back then, if you wanted your Apple II or TRS-80 to do something, you needed patience, technical know-how, and a high tolerance for frustration. There was no Google to answer your questions. If you got stuck, you had two choices. 1. Consult a massive instruction manual the size of a phone book. 2. Call a friend who maybe knew what they were doing. Programs weren't stored on sleek hard drives. They came on cassette tapes. Yes, cassette tapes. Loading a game or software required inserting the tape, adjusting the volume just right, and then waiting, and waiting, and waiting. If you were lucky, 15 minutes later, you'd have a simple text-based adventure game ready to play. If you weren't, well, better start over. One of the weirdest and most forgotten ways to get software back then? Radio broadcasts. Yep, some stations would transmit digital programs via audio signals, and all you had to do was record the sound onto a cassette, then load it into your computer. But there was a catch. If a loud noise interrupted the transmission, like, say, your mom turning on the blender, you could kiss that program goodbye. And let's not forget the keyboards. Modern keyboards are smooth, ergonomic, and easy to use. The keyboards on these early computers, they felt like typing on a typewriter mixed with a brick wall. Forget autocorrect. If you made a typo in a line of code, the whole thing crashed, and you had to start from scratch. But here's the thing, despite all the glitches, tape loading nightmares, and general insanity, having a home computer in the late 70s felt like owning a portal to the future. It was clunky, frustrating, and amazing all at once. And for the kids lucky enough to grow up with one, it was the ultimate glimpse into a world that was about to change forever. And if you think computers were a game changer, wait until you hear about the proto-internet system that people outside the US actually got to use. Teletext and Ceefax, before the World Wide Web, before dial-up modems, and way before you could scroll endlessly through social media, there was Teletext and Ceefax, a bizarre but revolutionary technology that gave people a glimpse into the future of information on demand. The catch? If you grew up in the US, you probably never experienced it. In the late 70s and early 80s, people in the UK and parts of Europe could turn on their TVs, press a button on their remote, and boom, they had instant access to news headlines, weather reports, stock market updates, sports scores, and even airline schedules. It was a text-based information service built right into television broadcasts. No internet, no downloads, just pure early digital magic. To Americans who never had it, this might sound like something out of a dystopian sci-fi flick. But for those who grew up with teletext or Ceefax, it was a game changer. Imagine being able to check sports scores without waiting for the news, or looking up movie times without calling the theater. It was clunky, slow, and kind of ugly, but it worked. One person described it as a pre-internet internet, a system where you could browse different pages of information using a simple menu-driven interface. The pages loaded instantly, since they were just text and basic graphics, and even though it was limited in content, it felt futuristic. Some kids even used it to cheat on homework, looking up facts faster than flipping through an encyclopedia. The coolest part? It even had video games. That's right. Hidden within teletext pages were basic, pixelated games that kids could play using their TV remote. Sure, it wasn't exactly next-gen gaming, but at a time when most people had never even seen a home computer, it was mind-blowing. But here's where things get weird. Despite its success in Europe, the US never really embraced teletext. A few American networks tried launching their own versions, but they never caught on. Maybe it was because cable TV was already taking over, or maybe Americans just weren't ready for a world where you could get instant news without flipping channels. Either way, by the time the internet rolled around in the 90s, teletext was on its way out, quietly fading into history. For those who remember it though, it was a glimpse into a future where information was always at your fingertips, decades before the internet made it a reality. And speaking of rapid change, let's talk about how the world visually transformed almost overnight when the 70s gave way to the 80s. The sharp transition from 70s to 80s aesthetics. If you grew up between 1976 and 1980, you had a front row seat to one of the strangest, most abrupt cultural makeovers in history. One day, everything was drenched in earthy browns, mustard yellows, and avocado greens. The next, it was neon pinks, electric blues, and futuristic chrome. It was as if someone flipped a switch and decided, enough with the wood paneling, let's make everything look like a synthesizer. Unlike other decade shifts, which tend to blend gradually, the change from the 70s to the 80s felt like a hard cut. It was as if society collectively agreed to retire the shag carpets and macrame plant hangers and replace them with angular furniture and pastel Miami Vice suits overnight. One person summed it up perfectly. Why did the 70s feel so brown, and then suddenly everything looked like a Tron movie? For kids, this shift was particularly jarring. Your favorite cartoons, which once had a muted, hand-drawn look, suddenly became hyper-colorful and futuristic. The posters on your bedroom wall went from featuring folksy album covers to laser grids and robots. Even the school cafeteria swapped out its dull, earthy color scheme for plastic trays in bright, unnatural shades. And don't even get started on fashion. In the late 70s, kids were still wearing bell-bottoms and corduroy everything. Then, seemingly overnight, you were expected to trade that in for parachute pants, bold geometric prints, and sunglasses that looked like they belonged in Blade Runner. This wasn't just a case of styles evolving, it was a total design revolution. Advertisements, TV shows, video games, and even household appliances followed suit. The bulky, wood-paneled TVs of the 70s started getting sleeker, phones began to lose their rotary dials, and suddenly, every company wanted their logo to look futuristic. Why did this happen so suddenly? Some say it was a mix of emerging technology, cultural shifts, and the collective exhaustion of the 70s earthy, mellow vibe. Others blame the rise of synthesizer music and sci-fi movies, which made everyone obsessed with sleek, high-tech aesthetics. Whatever the reason, by the time 1981 rolled around, the 70s felt ancient. For those who lived through this shift, it was surreal. One moment, you were watching reruns of Happy Days, and the next, you were living in a world that looked like an MTV fever dream. And if you thought a total aesthetic makeover was wild, just wait until we talk about the greatest low-tech thrill of childhood: parachute toys. Simple parachute toys. Before iPads, before gaming consoles, before even decent action figures, there was one toy that every kid from the late 70s remembers: the humble parachute man. It was simple, it was cheap, and it was absolutely thrilling. For those who never had the joy of launching one, here's how it worked. You got a small plastic soldier, or sometimes just a random figure, attached to a fabric or plastic parachute. You climbed to the highest point you could find, treehouse, rooftop, fire escape, or a dangerously wobbly chair, and let it fly. If the wind caught it just right, you got a glorious slow-motion descent. If not, well, let's just say more than a few ended up tangled in telephone lines for eternity. These weren't just toys, they were adventures. Some kids spent hours perfecting their launch technique, trying to get their parachute guy to land on a specific target. Others created full-blown missions, dropping them off from balconies and running downstairs in a dramatic rescue attempt. One person recalled having an Adventure People parachutist, a higher quality version with a real fabric parachute and a rubber harness. But even the cheap knockoffs, often bought from a gas station or stuffed into a birthday party goodie bag, were enough to provide endless fun. Some kids even made DIY parachutes, tying action figures to grocery bags and testing their aerodynamics, with varying degrees of success. Of course, the biggest enemy of parachute toys was bad deployment. If you didn't fold the chute just right, it would nosedive straight to the ground like a doomed skydiver. And if you were lucky enough to get a great flight, there was a good chance a gust of wind would carry it onto your neighbor's roof. Forever out of reach, but never forgotten. And yet, despite their simplicity, these toys were everywhere. Sold in toy aisles, carnival prize bins, and even the cheap section of department stores, they were a universal childhood experience. Eventually, as the 80s brought in fancier electronic toys, the parachute man faded into obscurity. But for those who grew up in the late 70s, that moment of watching your plastic soldier float gracefully to the ground was nothing short of magic. And speaking of childhood rituals, let's talk about the one event that every kid in this era lived for: Saturday morning cartoons. Saturday morning cartoons. If you were a kid growing up in the late 70s, you knew one universal truth: Saturday mornings were sacred. Forget sleeping in, forget chores. This was the one time of the week when kids owned the TV. From the moment you rolled out of bed in your pajamas, it was an all-you-can-watch buffet of cartoons, and nothing, not even your parents, could tear you away from that screen. Back then, cartoons weren't available 24/7. There was no streaming, no DVR, no on-demand anything. If you missed an episode, that was it. You had to wait weeks for a rerun, if you were lucky. That's what made Saturday mornings so special. Networks knew they had a very captive audience, so they packed the lineup with some of the most iconic cartoons of all time. We're talking about shows like Super Friends, Scooby-Doo, The Pink Panther Show, and Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids. Later in the decade, you got the Smurfs, the Littles, and the New Adventures of Flash Gordon. These weren't just cartoons, they were events. Kids planned their whole morning around them, usually with a bowl of sugary cereal in hand, probably Fruit Loops or Cap'n Crunch, because what was portion control? And let's not forget the commercials. Today, skipping ads is second nature, but back then, those toy and cereal commercials were part of the experience. G.I. Joe figures, Hot Wheels tracks, Stretch Armstrong, it felt like an endless parade of things you needed to beg your parents for. One of the most underrated parts of Saturday morning cartoons? The sheer chaos of the scheduling. There was no pausing, rewinding, or recording, so if two of your favorite shows aired at the same time on different channels, you had to make a choice. You'd frantically switch back and forth during commercial breaks, trying to catch as much of both as possible. It was a high-stakes game that every kid learned to master. Then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. By noon, the cartoons vanished, replaced by boring adult programming, probably a fishing show or golf tournament. That was the signal. Saturday morning belonged to kids, but Saturday afternoon, that was for grown-ups. As the 80s rolled in, cable television started changing everything. More channels meant more cartoons throughout the week, and eventually, the magic of the one-morning-only cartoon event started to fade. But for those who grew up in the late 70s, there was nothing quite like waking up on a Saturday, grabbing a bowl of cereal, and settling in for hours of animated greatness. And if you thought Saturday morning cartoons shaped childhood, wait until you hear how home decor got completely taken over by the pioneer Colonial aesthetic, the pioneer/colonial design trend. If you grew up between 1976 and 1980, there's a good chance your childhood home looked like it was sponsored by a museum gift shop. That's because, for some reason, the late 70s went all in on a pioneer colonial aesthetic. It wasn't just a style, it was a full-blown lifestyle choice. Picture it, dark wooden furniture with wrought iron accents, floral wallpaper with a ye olde twist, and candlestick holders everywhere. Maybe your grandma had a butter churn that wasn't just for decoration. Maybe your mom had a wooden spice rack that looked like it belonged in a Little House on the Prairie episode. Either way, homes of this era fully committed to the trend, whether it made sense or not. This wasn't just a random design choice either. The Bicentennial fever of 1976 played a huge role in the obsession with all things colonial. America was celebrating its 200th birthday, and suddenly every living room needed to look like it had hosted a Revolutionary War meeting. People bought furniture that looked like it belonged in an 18th century tavern, complete with carved wooden details and rustic finishes. Even businesses got in on it. Restaurants, department stores, and even doctors' offices adopted the theme. Some places went as far as installing faux wooden beams and decorating with fake muskets. Why? No one really knows. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe it was marketing, or maybe people just really liked the idea of pretending they were living in 1776 while eating their TV dinners. And let's talk about the carpets. Oh, the carpets. Deep red, dark blue, or full-on plaid. These were the kinds of carpets that could survive nuclear fallout. If your childhood home had thick, colonial-inspired carpeting, you know that thing is still there today, looking exactly the same as it did in 1978. Then, as quickly as it arrived, the pioneer colonial aesthetic disappeared. By the early 80s, people had moved on. The futuristic, neon-driven style of the decade took over, and suddenly those wooden eagle decorations and brass lanterns felt ancient. The transition was so abrupt that walking into a colonial-styled home in 1983 felt like stepping into a time capsule. But for those who grew up in this strange aesthetic era, the memory of dark wood, rustic charm, and way too many decorative eagles will always remain. And if you thought that was a strange phase, wait until we talk about the actual mindset of living in the late 70s, when technology was just beginning to change everything. the optimism of emerging technology. If you were a kid growing up between 1976 and 1980, you lived through a time when technology wasn't just evolving, it felt like a miracle in progress. Every year brought something new and futuristic, making the world feel like it was on the verge of something incredible. Arcades were popping up everywhere, home consoles were just beginning to change entertainment forever, and personal computers, though clunky and confusing, hinted at a future no one could fully grasp yet. Kids weren't just playing with new toys, they were witnessing history unfold in real time. One person summed it up best. It felt like we were living in the future. Home computers, digital watches, and video game consoles were just emerging. Every year something incredible came out and it felt like anything was possible. And they weren't wrong. In the late 70s, video games were shifting from something you only played at the mall arcade to something you could actually own at home. The Atari 2600, released in 1977, changed everything. Suddenly, you didn't have to beg for quarters to play Pong or Space Invaders, you could own them. It wasn't just entertainment, it was the first step toward an entirely new industry. Meanwhile, digital watches became the must-have gadget for kids. If you had a Casio or a Texas Instruments watch, you felt like James Bond, especially if it had a calculator built in. Never mind that you didn't need a calculator on your wrist, the fact that it existed was enough. Computers were another mind-blowing development, even though early models like the Apple II and TRS-80 were bulky, expensive, and required a ridiculous amount of patience. They felt like magic. For the first time, kids could tinker with code, store data, and play basic but addictive games, all from a box that sat in their living room. It was the first step toward a digital future, even if, at the time, loading a program meant inserting a cassette tape and waiting forever. And let's not forget robotics and space travel. Movies like Star Wars, 1977, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, 1978, made the future feel closer than ever. Kids dreamed of owning robots, astronauts were still rock stars, and even TV shows like Battlestar Galactica made it seem like space exploration was just around the corner. Of course, looking back, some of this cutting-edge technology seems hilariously outdated, but at the time, it was thrilling. The world was changing faster than ever before, and for kids growing up in this era, the excitement of watching technology evolve firsthand was unlike anything that came before or since. But if there's one thing that truly sets this time apart, it's the way people lived before everything became connected. Because once upon a time, there was no internet, no cell phones, just pure, uninterrupted life. Life before constant connectivity. If you grew up between 1976 and 1980, you experienced something that future generations will never fully understand. A world before constant connectivity. No internet, no smartphones, no social media. If you wanted to talk to a friend, you had to pick up a landline that was probably attached to the kitchen wall with a tangled cord and hope they were home. If they weren't, well, tough luck, you just have to try again later. Back then, plans were set in stone. If you told your friends to meet you at the arcade at 3 p.m., you had to be there at 3 p.m. There were no text messages to say you were running late, no last-minute "where are you" calls. You showed up or you missed out. Simple as that. And let's talk about going outside. In the late 70s, kids didn't sit inside all day scrolling through endless feeds or watching YouTube for hours. Instead, they roamed. It was completely normal for kids to disappear for hours after school, riding bikes, exploring creeks, or just wandering the neighborhood. Parents had a single rule: be home when the streetlights come on. That was the original Find My Friends app. If it was dark and you weren't home yet, you were in trouble. Weekends were different too. People actually visited each other. Families would just show up unannounced, expecting coffee and conversation. One person recalled, "Back then it was common to have a cake or pie ready because you never knew when visitors might drop by." Imagine that today, someone knocking on your door uninvited, absolute chaos. And if you wanted information, you had to work for it. Need to do a school report? No quick Google searches for you. You were heading straight to the library. Want to know what time a movie was playing? Better grab a newspaper or call the theater's automated hotline. Curious about a song you heard on the radio? Unless the DJ mentioned the name, you were out of luck until you heard it again. This lack of instant answers made life feel mysterious. There was a certain magic in not knowing everything all the time. You had to wait, guess, or figure things out the hard way. And that sense of curiosity and patience shaped an entire generation in ways that today's hyper-connected world never will. By the time the 80s rolled in, technology started creeping into everyday life. Cable TV brought more channels, answering machines meant you wouldn't miss a call, and early computers began hinting at what was to come. But for those who grew up in the late 70s, life before the digital takeover was something special. Slower, simpler, and in many ways, freer. And there you have it. 10 forgotten things that only those who grew up between 1976 and 1980 will truly remember. Which of these brought back memories for you? Drop a comment below and let's take a nostalgia trip together.